You know, a lot of the time, history is told through the stories of people. But today, we're going to do something a little different. We're going to tell the story of an object, a piece of steel and wood that didn't just witness history, it came to define an entire era. This is the story of the Carabiner 98K. First, just look at this number, over 14 million. Let that sink in for a second. That is a staggering amount. We're not talking about some rare, specialized piece of equipment. This was an industrial-scale tool of war, putting it in the hands of almost every single soldier, making it one of the most produced bolt-action rifles ever. For literally millions of soldiers, this rifle was their constant companion. It was the tool they carried from the farmlands of France all the way to the frozen battlefields of Russia. So, let's follow its journey and see how this one piece of engineering saw it all.
All right, so where did this thing even come from? What's its origin story? Well, to really get the Car 98K, we've got to go back. And not just to the 1930s, but to a time that many people consider the absolute golden age of bolt-action rifle design.
Its full name kind of tells you everything you need to know. Carabiner 98 Kurz. That just means carbine 98 short. And when it was officially adopted back in '35, it was built on a rock-solid reputation for three things. It was incredibly accurate, unbelievably reliable, and it packed a serious punch. See, the thing is, the Car 98K didn't just appear out of thin air. It was an evolution. It all started way back in 1898 with the famous Mauser action in the long Gewehr 98 rifle. Then, for years, designers tinkered with it, trying to make it shorter, handier, better for a more modern mobile soldier. And by 1935, they'd pretty much nailed it. So the design is locked in, production is ramping up, and this rifle is about to be tested in a brand new, terrifyingly effective kind of warfare. It was about to become the workhorse of the Blitzkrieg. In those early years of the war, this rifle was everywhere. It became a symbol of this overwhelming force. That image of a German soldier, Car 98K in hand, it was burned into the world's mind, completely linked with the shocking speed of those early victories. But hold on a second. You might be thinking, it's a bolt-action rifle. You have to manually cycle it for every single shot. How on earth was that effective in a lightning war? Well, here's the thing. It fit their military doctrine like a glove. See, the real firepower of a German squad came from its machine gun, the MG-34 or the later MG-42. The riflemen with their super accurate Car 98Ks, their job was to protect that machine gunner and pick off targets. The rifle was the anchor, not the main source of firepower. But technology never ever stands still, especially not in the middle of a war. And as the conflict dragged on, this legendary design found itself in a brand new and much, much tougher fight. And this, right here, is the big question for the middle part of this rifle story. Yeah, the early victories were huge. But the war itself was changing. The enemies were learning, adapting, and they were starting to bring some new toys to the fight. And wow, this slide right here just lays it all out. On one side, you have the slow, methodical, one-shot-at-a-time Car 98K. And on the other, its main American rifle, the semi-automatic M1 Garand. The difference wasn't just the 5 rounds versus 8. No, the real game changer was the action. The Garand semi-auto design created what they called a firepower gap, and it was becoming a huge problem. I mean, just look at these raw numbers. A really good soldier with a Car 98K might get off 15 rounds in a minute. An average GI with an M1 Garand could easily triple that. Seriously, put yourself in that firefight for a second. Imagine knowing that the guy shooting at you can fire 3 shots for every one of yours. That's terrifying. And this quote just hits the nail on the head. Mechanically, the Car 98K was still an amazing rifle. It was accurate, it was tough, but war isn't just about machines. It's psychological. Knowing you're outgunned makes you hesitate. It makes you keep your head down just a little bit longer. That psychological edge, or disadvantage, was just as deadly as the firepower gap itself. So, this brings us to the final chapter of this rifle's active service, and its absolutely incredible second life after the war was over. Because, believe me, its story does not end in 1945. Even as brand new advanced assault rifles like the STG-44 started showing up, the good old Car 98K kept rolling off the production lines. Why? Because it was simple and reliable to make, even when things were falling apart. They were still churning them out right up to the very end of the war, which really tells you something about the quality of that original design. After the war, This is where the rifle's journey gets really wild. First, millions of captured Kar 98Ks were scooped up and used by other armies all over the world. Then they hit the surplus market, becoming super popular hunting rifles. As time went on, people realized their historical value and they became prized collector's items. And of course, for so many of us, we know this rifle as a media star. It's basically in every single World War II movie or video game you can think of.
So today, the Kar 98K is all of these things at once. It's a historical artifact you might see in a museum. It's a treasured piece in someone's private collection. It's a digital gun on our screens. And yep, in some places, it's still a perfectly good sporting rifle. It has this incredible, multi-layered legacy that very few other weapons have.
When you look at the whole picture, the rifle's story is really one of transformation. It started out as the absolute best of its kind. Then it became an underdog, outmatched by new technology. And finally, it settled into its role as this enduring, iconic symbol of a world at war. And that kind of leaves us with one final thought. At the end of the day, the Kar 98K is just a machine, made of wood and steel. So what is it? What's that magic ingredient that elevates an object like this from just a tool of war into a timeless and sometimes even treasured piece of our shared history? All right, let's get right into it. This is a story about innovation born from pure desperation, with a little bit of battlefield espionage thrown in for good measure. We're talking about the Gewehr 43, the rifle that Germany literally copied from its enemy, all in a frantic effort to survive a brutal, changing war. Now, to really get the G43, you first have to picture where it came from, the Eastern Front. This wasn't just any battlefield. It was a total meat grinder, a massive, sprawling conflict where victory and defeat were often decided by sheer numbers and who could last the longest. And in a place like that, every single advantage, no matter how small, could make all the difference. Which brings up a really important question. What happens when the standard rifle your soldiers are carrying is just too slow? Well, that was the exact nail-biting problem the German forces were facing. They went into the war with a legendary rifle, for sure, but one that was showing its age, and fast. They were at a huge firepower disadvantage. And the numbers here, they really tell the whole story. On one side, you've got the German Kar 98K. It's a bolt-action rifle. Super reliable, super accurate, but slow. We're talking maybe 15 rounds a minute if you're good. On the other side, the Soviet SVT-40, a semi-automatic. That thing could spit out 25 rounds a minute. In a firefight, that 10-round gap wasn't just a statistic. It was the difference between living and dying. So the German High Command knew they had a major problem on their hands. They put their engineers on it right away. But their first swing at a solution? Well, to put it mildly, it was kind of a disaster. And here it is, the Gewehr 41, or G41 for short. On paper, this was supposed to be the answer to their prayers, a German-engineered semi-automatic rifle. But out in the real world, in the hands of a soldier, it was a complete nightmare. So what made it so bad? Well, for starters, it used this ridiculously complicated gas trap system at the muzzle to make the gun cycle. This thing would get clogged up with carbon fouling all the time. On top of that, the rifle was heavy, it was unbalanced, and it just could not handle the mud and the ice of the Eastern Front. It was a rifle that failed when you needed it the most. So, with their own design turning out to be a total dud, German engineers had to look for inspiration. And they found it in a very, very unlikely place. Just think about the pressure they were under. The soldiers at the front are getting outgunned, their brand new rifle is a bust, and they need a reliable semi-auto like yesterday. What on earth could they do? The solution was as simple as it was ruthless. They started picking up captured Soviet SVT-40 rifles from the battlefield, took them apart, and just copied the best parts of the design. And the secret sauce, the piece of stolen genius, was the short-stroke piston system. See, unlike the G41's clunky muzzle trap, the SVT-40 just siphoned off a tiny bit of gas from a port in the barrel. That gas pushed a little piston, which cycled the whole action. It was simple, it was elegant, and it was incredibly tough. So the German engineers basically just lifted that system and dropped it right into their new rifle. And what came out the other side was this, the Gewehr 43. It took that superior Soviet gas system and combined it with German manufacturing and a detachable 10-round magazine. It was a true hybrid weapon, born out of pure battlefield necessity. Okay, So they finally have the rifle they've been waiting for. But how did it actually do in a real fight? And, more importantly, how did it measure up against its biggest American competitor? When you put the G43 right up against the American M1 Garand, you start to see some really interesting differences. The G43 had that 10-round detachable magazine, which was a huge plus compared to the Grand's 8-round clip, which you had to use up completely. And here's the kicker. Pretty much every G43 was made with a scope rail, making it a fantastic marksman's rifle right out of the box. It really seems like the G43 should have been a game changer, right? It's a modern, capable rifle that fixed a huge problem. So was this the wonder weapon that was going to turn the tide for the German army? Well, not exactly. The first part of the answer is this number right here, about 400,000. That's roughly how many G43s were ever made. And yeah, that sounds like a lot of rifles, but in the grand scheme of World War II, it's barely a drop in the bucket. Because here's the context you need. The Americans, they made over 6 million M1 Grands. I mean, that's just a staggering difference. The G43 might have been a great rifle, but it was just completely swamped by the sheer industrial power of the Allies. So, after all that, what's the final call? How do we look back on this rifle that was, let's be honest, stolen from the enemy? Well, the G43's legacy is, it's complicated. The design itself was solid, it was effective. But as the war dragged on, Germany's industry was falling apart. Quality control on these rifles was often terrible, which led to problems in the field. And those production numbers were just way too low to make a real difference. It never even came close to replacing the old Carnine 8K. It's really the classic story of too little, too late. And that leaves us with one last question to chew on. Was the G43 a brilliant, pragmatic piece of innovation forged in the heat of battle? Or was it just a desperate footnote in the final chapter of a war machine that was grinding to a halt? The truth is, it was probably a little bit of both. And it's a heck of a reminder that wars aren't just won with clever designs, but with the massive industrial power to actually build them. Let's talk about a weapon that wasn't dreamed up in some design lab, but was born out of pure necessity right in the thick of the fighting. A rifle that came from desperation, but ended up changing warfare forever. This is the incredible story of the Sturmgewehr 44. Okay, I want you to picture this. You're a soldier, it's freezing cold, you see enemy soldiers way off in the distance, but your rifle is just too slow to effectively pin them down. Then, minutes later, they're right on top of you, and that same long rifle is way too clunky to fight with. You're always holding the wrong tool for the job. That exact deadly problem is what kicked off a revolution. So, yeah, this was the heart of the problem, what we're calling the soldier's dilemma. Out on the brutal Eastern Front, German soldiers were stuck in this impossible choice, having to pick between two very different weapons, and neither one was quite right. Look, on one hand, you had the Kar 98K rifle, an amazing long-range weapon, super accurate, but it was bolt action, so slow, really slow. On the other hand, you had the MP40 submachine gun. In close quarters combat, an absolute buzzsaw. But try to hit anything beyond 100 meters? Forget it. This left a huge, dangerous gap where most of the fighting actually happened, leaving soldiers incredibly vulnerable. The solution that finally emerged was just genius. And it didn't start with the gun. Nope. It started with rethinking the bullet. The engineers figured out the real problem wasn't the hardware. It was the software, the ammo that made it all run. And the big breakthrough was this, the intermediate cartridge. It was the perfect Goldilocks solution. It was powerful enough to be deadly out to 400 meters, which is where most combat takes place, but it had way less recoil than those big rifle rounds. And what does that mean? It means a soldier could actually control the weapon on full auto. It really was the best of both worlds. But of course, a revolutionary new bullet isn't much good by itself. It needed a whole new weapon built around it, brand new hardware designed from scratch to really make it sing. And, well, building that weapon turned out to be its own kind of war. You see, getting this thing made wasn't just an engineering puzzle. To get it into the hands of soldiers, its creators had to tiptoe through a political minefield and get it past the one guy who could kill the entire project with just a word. And there it is, the biggest roadblock of all. For his own reasons, mostly focusing on weapons already in production, Hitler had flat out said no to any new rifle designs. The project looked dead on arrival, but the guys who believed in it, they weren't about to give up that easily. So they got clever. They started playing games with the name. The first prototype was called the MKB-42, a machine carbine. When Hitler killed all new rifle programs, they just changed the name. They called it the MP-43, a machine pistol. It was a brilliant move because it just sounded like a small update to a weapon that was already approved, letting them keep working on it in secret. And guess what? The trick worked. The newly named MP-43 got sent to the front for field testing, and the soldiers who used it absolutely loved it. The weapon was a huge success. But something this good couldn't fly under the radar forever. So the story goes that when Hitler was finally shown the weapon and saw what it could do, he was just blown away. He apparently fired it himself, and he was so impressed that he personally gave it a new name. He supposedly exclaimed, "That is a storm rifle." And the name, Sturmgewehr, stuck. It was not only official, it was a killer piece of propaganda. And on the battlefield, man, did it live up to that name. The Sturmgewehr 44 was the answer to the soldier's dilemma. It completely closed that deadly gap in the fighting, giving one soldier a single weapon that could do it all at almost any distance. It was exactly what they'd been crying out for. Here's the thing, though. The SG-44s showed up too late, and there were never enough of them to really change the outcome of the war. Its real impact, its undeniable legacy, would be felt for decades and decades to come. Because this is the real heart of the story. The SG-44 wasn't just a new gun. It was a whole new type of gun. It wrote the definition for what we now call an assault rifle: select fire, intermediate cartridge, detachable magazine. It literally created the blueprint for the modern infantry weapon. And its influence spread like wildfire. You can draw a direct line. 1944, the SG-44 proves the concept. Just 3 years later, you get the Soviet AK-47, which was built on many of the same core ideas. Then, by the 1960s, the Americans adopt the M16. And just like that, the concept pioneered by the SG-44 was the undisputed king of the battlefield worldwide. So when you boil it all down, the ideas that came out of all that desperation on the Eastern Front, the special cartridge, the ability to switch from single shots to full auto, the all-in-one design, they became the absolute foundation for every modern soldier's rifle. The SG-44 literally set the standard that almost every army on Earth still follows today. Which leaves us with a pretty wild thought to end on, right? The Sturmgewehr was built to solve one very specific problem in one very specific war. But in doing that, did it accidentally write the playbook for almost every single war that came after it? Now that's something to think about.
Today, we're diving into a really fascinating piece of military history. It's a story all about incredible ambition, born from a really desperate problem during World War II. And it led to one of the most advanced and, one of the rarest rifles of the entire war. So why is it called a ghost gun? Well, let's get into it.
I want you to just imagine this for a second. You're a paratrooper. You're jumping out of a plane, flying deep behind enemy lines. So what's your biggest fear right then? It's probably not the enemy soldier on the ground. Not yet. It's the jump itself. It's the landing. It's that terrifying feeling of being totally alone and basically defenseless in hostile territory.
So, to really get a handle on the weapon at the heart of our story today, you've got to understand this unique and, frankly, incredibly dangerous problem that Germany's elite airborne forces, the Fallschirmjäger, were facing. These guys were called sky soldiers, and they had a massive challenge on their hands.
Okay, so here was the real issue. German paratroopers jumped with next to nothing. I mean, their main rifles, their machine guns, all the heavy gear, it was all dropped in totally separate canisters. So when they hit the ground, often scattered all over the place by the wind, all they had was a pistol and maybe a few grenades. You can see how this would make them just unbelievably vulnerable until they could fight their way over to their equipment, and that's if they could even find it.
A problem like that? It demanded a pretty radical solution. The German High Command knew they needed to give their elite paratroopers an equally elite weapon, a single gun, that could, hopefully, solve all these problems at once.
And the idea they came up with was, for the time, absolutely revolutionary. They didn't just need a better rifle. No, they needed what they called a universal weapon. Something light enough that you could actually carry it during the jump, but powerful enough to act as your rifle, your submachine gun, and even your light machine gun. Basically a one-size-fits-all solution for the total chaos of an airborne assault.
And the weapon they designed to meet this seemingly impossible demand was built from the ground up for one purpose. And its name? Well, its name tells the entire story. It was the direct answer to that paratrooper's dilemma.
They called it the Fallschirmjägergewehr 42, or, FG-42 for short. It was developed specifically for these airborne troops, and the 42 marks the year it was designed, 1942. This thing wasn't just another rifle. It was basically a complete weapon system all in one single package. It's actually pretty cool if you break down the name. Fallschirm means parachute, Jäger means hunter, which was a term they used for elite light infantry, and Gewehr is just the German word for rifle. So, you put it all together, and it's literally the parachute hunter's rifle. The name itself is a mission statement.
So what could this rifle actually do? Well, for starters, it fired the full-power 7.92mm Mauser cartridge. That's the same heavy-hitting round that Germany used in its standard machine guns. But the most important feature, the real game-changer, was its ability for selective fire.
Selective fire meant a paratrooper could use it for careful, precise, single shots, like a standard rifle. Or, with the flip of a switch, he could go fully automatic and lay down suppressive fire like a light machine gun. This was all thanks to an absolutely ingenious design. It fired from a closed bolt in semi-auto mode, which is great for accuracy, and from an open bolt in full auto to keep it from overheating. It was truly like having two guns in one.
Okay, so we've got this incredible, super advanced weapon. It should have completely changed the game, right? Well, this is where the story takes a bit of a turn. Now we have to look at the huge gap between this brilliant design and the actual impact it had on the war.
The hard reality was, despite its genius, the FG-42 was really complex and very expensive to make, and wartime Germany, at this point, just couldn't produce enough of them. It became a ghost gun, this futuristic weapon that very, very few soldiers ever actually saw on the battlefield.
Its service life was incredibly short. It was developed in 42, but it didn't see its first real action until 1943. And by the time it was being produced in any kind of real numbers, the huge, large-scale German airborne operations it was designed for, they were pretty much over. Its whole story is confined to those last, desperate years of the war.
And that leaves us with this really fascinating question. Was the FG-42 a failure because it had so little impact on the war? Or was it actually a stunning success, just in terms of design? A weapon so far ahead of its time that its true influence wouldn't really be seen until after the war, when it started shaping the designs of future weapons, like the American M60 machine gun and the whole concept of the modern battle rifle. That's the complex legacy of the paratrooper's ghost gun.